Veteran found wounded officer and K9 dog collapsed on rainy porch. What happened next will break you. The storm rolled across Silver Creek like an army that had forgotten how to retreat. Rain lashed the tin roof of the old farmhouse. Wind rattled the shutters, and thunder cracked so close it seemed to shake the bones of the land itself. Inside, Thomas Grayson sat alone at his kitchen table, a lantern flickering at his elbow. He had chosen this place for silence, for distance, for the kind of solitude a man with too many ghosts might believe would keep them at bay. But tonight, the storm made solitude sound like gunfire. Then came the scratching. At first, he thought it was just a branch against the door, the storm's mischief. But beneath the howl of the wind was another sound, a low, broken whine, the kind a man who'd heard battlefield cries could never mistake for anything but pain. Thomas pushed back his chair, his instincts surging faster than thought. When he flung open the door, the lantern light spilled across a sight that rooted him to the spot. A young police officer, barely more than a boy, slumped across the porch, blood slicking his uniform, his chest heaving shallowly. Beside him, a German shepherd staggered to its feet, one hind leg dragging, but still forcing itself upright between the stranger and the night. The dog's eyes burned with defiance, even as its body trembled. Rain hammered down, plastering the officer's hair to his pale forehead, pooling in the grooves of the porch. The dog gave a single bark, hoarse, defiant, pleading, and Thomas felt the years collapse. He had carried men off battlefields with less life in them than this officer showed. He had seen dogs stand guard over fallen soldiers until they themselves collapsed. And now, both man and beast had come to his door, asking without words for the thing he thought he no longer had to give: sanctuary. He did not hesitate. He bent, heaved the officer's weight across his shoulders with a grunt, and jerked his head toward the dog. "Inside, soldier," he rasped. The shepherd limped forward, dripping water and blood onto the wooden floor as Thomas kicked the door shut against the storm. In the silence that followed, broken only by the thunder and the ragged breaths of his unexpected guests, Thomas realized that whatever peace he had been chasing on this land was gone. The war had found him again on his own porch. Silver Creek was the kind of Texas town that existed between highways where strangers rarely stopped unless they had a reason. The land was flat, stitched with barbed wire fences, dotted with barns that leaned with the memory of better harvests. Thomas Grayson had chosen his farm on the outskirts precisely for that reason. Nothing moved here unless the wind commanded it. He thought he could live out his days with only the sound of cicadas in summer, the rustle of mesquite trees, and the whisper of rain on tin roofs to keep him company. At 45, Thomas looked older than his years. War had done that. 2 tours overseas, 1 honorable discharge, and a lifetime of memories he tried not to summon. His body bore the scars of shrapnel, but it was the invisible weight behind his eyes that spoke louder. He carried himself like a soldier even in solitude, back straight, movements efficient, his boots always lined by the door. To the neighbors, he was the quiet veteran who kept his land neat and his conversations brief. To himself, he was a man trying to outrun the battlefield echoes that crept in with every storm. That night, the storm brought him Daniel Hayes. Daniel was 28, a patrol officer in the county sheriff's department. He was broad-shouldered but lean, the way men grow into their strength without yet realizing how much of it they'll need. His uniform was torn, his skin pale beneath streaks of blood. When Thomas laid him on the couch, the young man groaned, his lips moving around fragments of words. Trap, ambush, Axel. His right hand clenched reflexively, as if still reaching for his sidearm. And then there was Axel. Even wounded, the German shepherd carried himself with the dignity of a soldier. His sable coat was matted with rain and blood, his right hind leg dragging awkwardly, but he refused to collapse until Thomas gestured firmly at a blanket on the floor. Only then did Axel lower himself, though his eyes never left Daniel. The dog's gaze was both fierce and tender, amber irises glowing in the lantern light, his breath ragged but steady. Thomas had seen dogs like him before, war dogs that patrolled perimeters, searched rubble for the living, and sometimes stayed behind with the dead. They were trained for loyalty, for sacrifice, but Axel's devotion was something deeper. Even broken, he positioned his body between Daniel and the door, a sentinel unwilling to yield. Thomas worked quickly, his hand steady despite the storm of memory inside him. He pressed cloth against Daniel's wound, muttered reassurances more for himself than the boy, and reached for the phone mounted on the wall. His call went not to the sheriff, trust was scarce in Thomas's vocabulary, but to Emily Carter, a veterinarian who had once patched up strays for the soldiers' children and now lived 2 miles down the road. She answered groggily, but when Thomas mentioned injured K9, her voice sharpened. "I'll be there in 10. While waiting, Thomas tended to Axel as best he could. He crouched, palm open, and let the dog decide. Axel sniffed, then lowered his head into the soldier's hand with a shudder that was almost relief. "Good boy," Thomas murmured. "You held the line." His voice cracked on the last word because he knew exactly what it meant to hold the line until your body gave out. When Emily arrived, rain dripping from her coat, she went straight to Axel. Her hands were practiced, her words brisk but soothing. "Gunshot wound, grazed the leg. He's lucky." She cleaned and stitched, Axel whimpering but never snapping, his trust absolute. When she was done, she laid a hand briefly on Thomas's arm. "Whatever happened out there, you've bought them time." As dawn broke gray and sodden, Thomas sat in a chair between the couch where Daniel slept and the blanket where Axel lay. His rifle leaned against the wall, his boots still damp from the storm. He looked at the young officer, at the battered dog, and felt the fragile threads of his hard-won solitude fray. Fate had delivered them to his porch, broken and hunted, and he knew with grim certainty the quiet life he had carved here was about to be shattered. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving Silver Creek washed in gray light. The fields shimmered with puddles, and the air smelled of wet earth and cedar. Inside the farmhouse, the silence was heavier than the rain had been, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove Thomas had stoked before dawn. Daniel stirred first. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with the sudden instinct of a man who expected danger still close. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his side, and he fell back with a groan. Before Thomas could move, Axel was there. The dog struggled upright, dragging his wounded leg, and pressed his nose against Daniel's hand. The officer's fingers curled into the thick fur, and his breathing slowed, steadied by that simple contact. "Easy, kid," Thomas said from his chair. His voice was gravel, but not unkind. "You're safe here. Storm's over." Daniel's lips parted, dry, voice hoarse. "Axel, is he?" "Alive," Thomas cut in. "Thanks to a vet I called in. Stubborn as they come. He didn't leave your side, even bleeding out on my porch." Daniel exhaled, relief flickering across his pale face. He turned his head slightly, meeting Thomas's eyes for the first time. "You saved us." Thomas shifted, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just opened a door. That dog did the rest." Axel lowered himself carefully, resting his chin on Daniel's chest as though staking a claim. The young officer closed his eyes, fingers still buried in the shepherd's fur. For a long moment, the farmhouse felt less like a battlefield triage station and more like a sanctuary, fragile but real. Later, when Emily returned to check Axel's stitches, she found the three of them gathered around the stove. Thomas with a mug of coffee, Daniel sipping broth from a chipped cup, and Axel stretched between them, his body bridging the space. She smiled softly. "Looks like you've found each other." The bond deepened over the next days in small, unspoken gestures. Thomas noticed the way Axel tracked his every movement, not just Daniel's. When Thomas stepped out to chop wood, the dog limped after him, planting himself nearby as if guarding not only his master, but this new ally too. Thomas would pause mid-swing, meeting those amber eyes, and feel a tug he hadn't expected, a reminder of comradeship he thought buried with his unit. Daniel, for his part, learned to trust the gruff veteran's steady competence. When fever gripped him one night, Thomas sat through the hours, wringing cloths in cold water, his presence as unyielding as the farmhouse walls. Daniel whispered fragments of the ambush through delirium, names, shadows, the hiss of betrayal, but it was Axel who anchored him, pressing against him until his trembling eased. On the third morning, Daniel managed to sit upright without collapsing. He reached down to stroke Axel's head, then glanced at Thomas. "He saved me out there, took a bullet meant for me. I thought I'd lost him." His voice cracked, and for a heartbeat, he looked younger than his years, stripped of the badge and the uniform, just a man grateful for loyalty he didn't deserve. Thomas nodded, staring into the stove's flames. "Dogs like him don't quit, not till their last breath." He hesitated, then added, quieter, "Neither do soldiers." The words hung in the room, a bridge across generations, across wounds. Daniel looked at the older man with new respect, and Axel, sensing the weight of the moment, thumped his tail once against the floor. What began as a rescue on a rainy night had become something else, a connection forged in blood, loyalty, and the simple act of surviving together. None of them said it aloud, but all three understood. The storm that had driven them together was only the beginning. The days stretched into a fragile routine. Thomas fed the animals in the morning, checked the fences, and returned to find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, his uniform shirt washed and folded neatly nearby, Axel resting faithfully at his feet. On the surface, the farmhouse seemed ordinary again, but beneath that quiet beat, the pulse of stories both men carried like shrapnel, too deep to remove, too painful to ignore. It was Daniel who first broke the silence. One evening, when the rain had returned in a lighter drizzle, he sat staring at the streaked window, his untouched bowl of stew cooling in front of him. Axel nudged his knee, but Daniel's gaze stayed far away. "I was supposed to be safe with them," he whispered. Thomas didn't ask who them was. He simply leaned back in his chair, waiting. The younger man's jaw tightened, then loosened. The red vultures. Everyone knows they run drugs through this county. I'd been tracking them for months, gathering leads, but what I didn't know, what no one wanted to believe, was that someone inside the department was feeding them information. His eyes shifted to Thomas, guilt etched deep. The ambush wasn't luck. They knew I was coming, knew Axel was with me. They wanted us gone. He rubbed the scar still raw beneath his bandages. Axel took the first hit, still dragged me out of the kill zone, bleeding all the way. He saved me, and his voice cracked, his fists clenched. I led him straight into it. Axel lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against Daniel's chest. The officer folded into the gesture, shoulders trembling. Thomas looked away, the sight pulling at memories he had kept buried. He had seen men curse themselves for living when their brothers hadn't. He recognized the weight of survivors' guilt sitting on Daniel's spine. It was the same weight Thomas carried every day. That night, as Daniel slept fitfully on the couch, Thomas sat outside on the porch, rifle across his lap, the storm misting his face. He let the past come, the way it always did when the night was too quiet. He had been 19 when the Marines shipped him off. By 20, he had learned the smell of burning sand, the metallic taste of fear, the hollow silence after an explosion. His platoon had been tight-knit, bound by necessity more than choice. But war devoured them one by one. There was one night he could never forget, an ambush on the outskirts of Fallujah. Gunfire stitched the dark, his friend Morales falling with a shout that cut off too quickly. Thomas had dragged him behind a crumbling wall, pressing his hands against a wound that poured faster than any field dressing could hold. Morales had looked at him, eyes wide, lips shaping words Thomas couldn't hear through the roar of fire. And then he was gone, slipping away in Thomas's arms. He had carried Morales's dog tags home, mailed them to his family, and never spoken his name again. The Army gave him medals, but medals didn't silence the screams that woke him at night. He left the service at 35, 10 years too late, and bought the farm at Silver Creek because he believed distance could dull memory. But memory traveled with him. When Thomas returned inside, Axel was watching him. The shepherd's amber eyes met his, and for a moment, Thomas swore the dog knew, recognized a man who carried ghosts just as heavy as his own. He crouched, scratching behind Axel's ear, his voice low. "You and me, boy, we've both seen too much." The next morning, Daniel found Thomas repairing a section of fence. He leaned against the post, still pale, but steadier. "You were military," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, hammering the nail home. "Long time ago." "You lost people," Daniel pressed softly. Thomas paused, jaw tightening. "We all did." He set the hammer down, looking across the fields where the mist still clung. "War doesn't just end when you come home. It follows you, sits on your chest when you try to sleep, reminds you of every face you couldn't save." Daniel swallowed hard, his hand resting on Axel's head. "Then you know." "I know," Thomas said. The two words were heavy, final, a bridge spanning the years between them. From that day, something unspoken bound the three together, soldier, officer, and dog. Each bore wounds carved by betrayal, violence, and survival. Each carried ghosts too stubborn to leave. Yet, in the farmhouse, among the steady rituals of tending land and tending one another, the ghosts seemed, for the first time, willing to share their weight. Still, both men knew peace was temporary. Shadows lingered at the edge of the fields. Axel's ears pricked at noises Thomas couldn't hear, And when a bullet shattered the barn window one dusk, embedding itself in the wooden beam inches above Daniel's head, they understood the past wasn't finished with them yet. The bullet lodged in the barn beam was the first warning. The second came a night later, when the livestock pen went up in flames, the dry timber exploding into sparks that lit the sky like artillery. Thomas and Daniel sprinted into the blaze with buckets and shovels, but it was Axel who first hurled himself against the smoke, barking furiously at the shadow darting away into the mesquite. By the time Thomas raised his rifle, the figure had vanished into the storm. When dawn came, the smell of charred wood clung to their clothes, the barn little more than a blackened skeleton. Daniel sat on the porch steps, bandaged arm cradled against his chest, his eyes dark with fury. "They know we're alive," he muttered, "and they're not done." Thomas studied the horizon, his jaw tight. "Then neither are we." That day, Daniel told the rest of the story. The Red Vultures weren't just another cartel. They were embedded in Silver Creek, their roots tangled with local politics and law enforcement. Daniel had traced financial ledgers back to the sheriff's office itself, where Deputy Carl Donovan, his superior, the man who had sworn to protect him, had been laundering money and feeding intelligence to Cain, the gang's ruthless leader. Daniel had been too close to exposing them. That's why they tried to silence him. Thomas listened in silence, the lines on his face deepening. Betrayal was an old story, but it never lost its sting. He had trusted commanders once who sent young men into firefights with faulty intel only to write their deaths off as acceptable losses. He saw the same shadows now in Daniel's eyes. That evening, Thomas walked the perimeter of the farm with Daniel and Axel limping at his side. "If they're coming back," Thomas said grimly, "we'll be ready." They began to turn the farmhouse into a fortress. Windows were reinforced with sandbags. Old fence posts were sharpened into stakes and sunk into the earth at choke points. Tripwires, scavenged from Thomas's military trunk in the attic, were stretched across the fields, rigged to shotgun shells loaded with blanks, a warning system loud enough to wake the dead. Daniel used what strength he had to help, sketching diagrams on scraps of paper, recalling tactical training from the academy. Axel patrolled tirelessly, hobbling but alert, his ears swiveling to every distant crack of a branch. On the third night, a shadow fell across the far pasture. A rifle barrel glinted faintly under the moon. "Sniper!" Daniel hissed, dragging Thomas down. The shot rang out, splintering the post behind them. Before Thomas could return fire, Axel launched from the porch, a streak of muscle and fury, sprinting toward the mesquite line despite his wounded leg. The sniper fired again, but the shepherd veered, forcing the man to retreat. Thomas's shot followed, precise and punishing, dropping the rifle from the intruder's hands. By the time they reached the tree line, Axel had the man pinned, teeth clamped around his arm until he dropped to his knees, screaming. Daniel recognized him instantly. "Donovan's errand boy," he spat. The thug stammered, pleaded, but Thomas's rifle stayed steady, his voice low and cold. "You tell your boss this land isn't his. He comes himself, or he doesn't come back." The captive was hauled inside, tied to a chair in the barn that still smelled of smoke. Under the dim lantern, he broke quickly, spilling names, routes, and the plan. Cain and Donovan were preparing a full assault on the farm to erase loose ends once and for all. When Emily came by to check Axel's stitches, she found the farmhouse transformed. Maps spread across the table, rifles cleaned, tripwires set. "This isn't a hospital," she said, her voice tight. "It's a war zone." Thomas met her gaze unflinching. "War came to my porch. I'm not letting it take this place without a fight." Daniel, pale but resolute, placed a hand on Axel's head. "They'll come hard, but we'll be ready. We have to be, for everyone they've hurt." Outside, the sun sank into blood-red clouds. The farm lay quiet, bristling with hidden defenses. In the stillness, Thomas felt the old weight return, the pre-battle calm he had known too many times before. But this fight was different. This wasn't a foreign war. This was his home, his porch, his second chance. And when the red vultures came, they would find not just a broken soldier, not just a wounded cop, not just a limping dog. They would find 3 survivors welded together by loyalty and loss, ready to hold the line. Night descended heavy and still, the kind of silence that sets teeth on edge. The farmhouse crouched like a lone sentinel under the moon, its windows blacked out, its yard seeded with tripwires and barricades. Inside, Thomas checked his rifle one last time, fingers steady despite the storm that beat in his chest. Daniel loaded his sidearm, his wounded arm bound tight, his face pale but resolved. Axel paced the floorboards, the limp in his hind leg obvious, but his eyes blazing with a defiance that no injury could dim. Then came the sound, a convoy rumbling down the dirt road, headlights slashing across the fields, engines cut, doors slammed, voices murmured. Kane, the Red Vulture's leader, had arrived with his men, and beside him strode Carl Donovan, badge still pinned to his chest like a mockery. The first wave hit just past midnight. A Molotov arced through the air, shattering against the barn's charred remains. Fire licked upward, but the trap snapped shut. Thomas's rigged shotgun blanks thundered, echoing across the pasture like heavy artillery. The gangsters flinched, diving for cover. From the farmhouse windows, Thomas and Daniel opened fire, forcing them back. Bullets cracked against wood and stone, splinters flying. Kane's voice roared across the field. "Burn them out!" Men advanced, but Axel was already in motion. He barreled through the door into the night, teeth bared, body low. A gunshot rang, grazing his flank, yet he kept charging, slamming into the nearest intruder. The man screamed as the shepherd's jaws clamped on his wrist, the pistol clattering into the dirt. Daniel burst from cover to finish the arrest, his good arm hauling the thug into the barricade. Donovan emerged then, shouting orders, his rifle flashing. "Stand down, Hayes," he bellowed. "You're a dead man anyway." Daniel's reply was a single shot that shattered the lantern by Donovan's feet, showering him in sparks. Rage twisted the traitor's face. He raised his weapon, but Axel lunged again, dragging him down in a whirl of teeth and fury. The fight collapsed into mud and blood, Donovan screaming as the shepherd refused to yield. Thomas, holding the line at the north fence, saw Kane himself cutting through the chaos, shotgun in hand. The old soldier's instincts roared alive. He broke cover, rolled behind a trough, and when Kane stepped into the open, Thomas fired. The cartel leader spun, weapon flying, crashing into the dirt. For a moment, silence cracked the battle wide open. Then came the distant wail of sirens, FBI reinforcements, Doyle's promised unit, cresting the road in a flood of flashing lights. The Red Vultures panicked, scattering into the fields, only to be met by agents pouring in from every side. One by one, they dropped their weapons, hands in the air. The gunfire faded, replaced by the hiss of burning debris and the ragged breaths of survivors. Thomas lowered his rifle, his knees threatening to give. Daniel limped to his side. Axel pressed between them, his chest heaving, blood streaking his fur. The shepherd sagged, but his eyes still locked on Donovan, now pinned to the dirt and handcuffs, howling like a caged animal. Thomas dropped a hand to Axel's ruff, voice breaking. "You did it, boy. You held the line." Daniel knelt, pulling the dog close, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "You saved us. Again." The farmhouse stood battered, the land scarred, but they were alive. And as the agents hauled the gang away, Thomas felt something he hadn't in years. A battlefield won not for flag or orders, but for home, for family. The weeks that followed were a blur of repairs and reckonings. The FBI swept through Silver Creek, dismantling the Red Vultures piece by piece. Their influence burned away like rot under sunlight. Donovan faced the courts in shackles, his badge stripped from his chest in disgrace. Daniel's name was cleared, his courage recognized in headlines that called him the officer who refused to die. But the true healing did not come from medals or ceremonies. It came slowly on the quiet land Thomas had once thought would be his tomb of solitude. Neighbors who had kept their distance now appeared with hammers and lumber, helping to rebuild the barn. Emily brought pies and medicine, her laughter softening the edges of grief that still lingered. Children from the nearby ranches ran through the pastures, their shouts of joy echoing where silence had once ruled. And at the center of it all was Axel, limping but unbroken, moving among them like a living banner of survival. His scars became part of the farm's story, proof that even wounds could be worn as honors. Daniel stayed on at the farmhouse, his bond with Thomas deepening into something more than circumstance. They worked the land side by side, sowing winter wheat where ashes had fallen. At night, they shared quiet words over coffee, the kind of conversations only men who had stood at the edge and returned could understand. Daniel often said he owed his life to Thomas, but the older man shook his head. "We both owe it to him," he'd reply, nodding toward Axel, sprawled by the fire with his head heavy on their boots. For Thomas, the farm was no longer a refuge from the world. It was a place returned to life. He had fought his last battle not in some faraway desert, but here on his porch, defending something that finally felt worth the fight. He had learned that peace was not found in running from ghosts, but in standing guard with others who carried them too. On a crisp spring morning, Thomas watched Daniel and Axel walking the fence line together, the officer's arm still bound but stronger, the dog's tail swaying with every step. The sight filled him with a warmth he had not felt since before the war, a certainty that he was no longer alone. He closed his eyes, breathed in the scent of fresh-turned soil, and let the truth settle in his bones. Peace was not the absence of battle, but the presence of family, chosen, scarred, loyal beyond measure, because not all heroes wear uniforms, and not all wars are fought abroad. Sometimes the bravest stand is made at home, with a rifle, a wounded friend, and a faithful dog who refuses to fall. And on that patch of Texas land, Thomas Grayson had finally found his way home.